everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the fourth event in the 2017 Lamda Human Rights Project Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Bethany Barrett. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Joseph Lamda Human Rights Project. I'm going to just briefly say a few words of thanks and then introduce our wonderful panelists today. I'm so excited about this discussion and so glad that you all were able to join us. Before I introduce them, just want to say again a few words of thanks. First, in a conversation that's about immigration, I think it's really appropriate to just acknowledge that we're on traditional Illini, Miami, and Ho-Chunk territory and sort of just be acknowledging of that and honoring of the fact that we're all immigrants here to one extent or another. I want to also thank several people that are here today and a few that aren't. First and foremost, Joe Lowndes, who is the just brain trust behind the Joseph Lamda Human Rights Project. So Joe is an alum of Roosevelt and also of the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration. He is also the current president of the College of Arts and Sciences Advisory Board here at Roosevelt. He's the president of the Chicago Art Deco Society. He's the co-author of a forthcoming book on Art Deco in Chicago that is called, I want to make sure I get it right, Art Deco Chicago, Making America Modern, president of the International Board, the board of the International Coalition of Art Deco Societies, and involved in just a huge number of social justice initiatives here in the city. So Joe's generosity and initiative has made possible field experiences both here and abroad for 9 generations now of Lamda human rights scholars. And I just couldn't imagine sort of the life of the college without these initiatives, and I'm so grateful. I also want to thank in the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Bonnie Gunzenhauser and Julie Rowan, as well as our Director of Development, Erica Weiss-Musolewski. The Lamda Human Rights Project is a unique project in the country because it basically engages students in the study of several interconnected human rights challenges. So what we do is explore the sources and implications of a given human rights challenge. This year it's populism, from as many different vantage points as we possibly can. So we've gone down and looked at the effects of deindustrialization on the southeast side. We are visiting immigrant communities. We are visiting several places that were sites of early racial tension in the very first periods of Chicago's history, and we are also trying to learn from experts in the field, and which is what all of these conversations are about, is bringing us into conversation with each other around sometimes very challenging issues. We also learn from the comparable experiences of various communities elsewhere. So we go abroad each year to look at comparable human rights and social justice challenges somewhere else. So we're going to be going to London in about 3.5 weeks to look at the populism that led to Brexit there. Today, we are very honored to welcome 4 amazing organizers. So first, Cindy Agustin is an advocate for immigrant rights in Chicago. She began organizing with the Immigrant Youth Justice League, an undocumented youth-led organization in Chicago, in 2010, and the University of Chicago Coalition for Immigrant Rights at the University of Chicago, advocating for rights of undocumented students on campus. She's a founding member of the Protection for All movement, which is a collective that's led by undocumented community members, which aims to fight for justice for all migrants with a distinctly humane approach rather than just an economic one. She's currently a second-year student at the School of Social Service Administration at U of C and is interested in the intersection of immigration policies, undocumented and immigrant-led advocacy, and mental health. Antonio Garcia has been combining his tech mind with his activist heart since he graduated with a degree in information and decision sciences. He began at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights as an intern who quickly moved on to managing statewide outreach campaigns, eventually organizing for forward.us, that's fwd.us. Earlier this year, Antonio worked under a fellowship from the Vocal Foundation in which he put together the Daca Network. Currently, he splits his time between teaching Latinx children how to code, a new educational program focusing on entrepreneurship, and pushing for immigrant rights through Protection for All. So he's actually going to be stepping out a few minutes early because he needs to go and teach kids how to code, which is the best possible excuse I can imagine. Luis Gomez is an undocumented organizer for immigration justice. He's a student of biochem at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he started organizing undocumented student allies, or USA. He co-led a campaign for the creation of a scholarship, United Minds Inspiring Innovation, for undocumented students at IIT, where now this fund awards 7 to 10 undocumented student scholarships each semester. Which is amazing. He has also been involved in the fight for higher education access for undocumented students on the state level through organizing for passing of the Access Bill, which would give open scholarships for undocumented students in all state universities. He's a founding member of Protection for All as well. And finally, Angelica Magana is a Mexican immigrant and has lived in Illinois since she was 8. She is currently undocumented, but was able to take advantage of Obama's Daca executive order and has been politically active since June 16th, 2015. And for those of you that sounds familiar to, that's the date that Donald Trump announced he was running for the presidential nomination. Angelica is currently active in the Protection for All movement and is passionate about fighting for immigrants' rights. I just want to say on a more personal note that I first met Angelica at a panel that was organized by the Chicago Action Alliance in May. I had just spent several weeks in a remote part of the country, and I was really hungry for political engagement. And it was a time where there just felt like there was so much going on that it was really hard to sort through what the priorities would be and how we could address all the things that were happening on all fronts. At a time when I, like so many, were feeling very frustrated and angry and a little bit impotent, Angelica was so eloquent and impassioned that one could not help but feel both energized and optimistic. It was the perfect catalyst to mine, and I know she's been a catalyst for others' political engagement. In our conversations over the last few months, I've come to appreciate sort of how deep that commitment and yet calm really is. And Angelica has had a lot to do with the way that this panel and the one last week have shaken out. And when I've spoken to these other panelists that are here today, it became really clear why the Protection for All movement has been so powerful and has had so much momentum, because it's this moment where our federal government and many others are really motivating folks based on fear and division. And this community builds its strength through trust and solidarity. And they also have a lot more wisdom than we're going to be able to share in just an hour and a half. So I will be turning things over to them now. But I wanted to just give each of them a small token of my gratitude and esteem, which is also a nod to the fact that migration is beautiful and natural. They're little buttons with monarch butterflies on them. It also acknowledges the fact that this is the time when the monarch butterflies, almost the time when the monarch butterflies arrive back in Michoacan. They travel from the Great Lakes all the way down there, thousands of miles. And if they can do it, surely we can find ways for humans to do it in a more humane way as well. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I will give you these little treats before we get started. In a little Halloween bag, no less. So I think we're going to start with giving a little bit of background from Angelica. We are structuring this as a conversation, so I really want to encourage you, if you have questions or comments or things that you feel moved to add at any point, please feel free to raise your hand, and we will try to incorporate you in a really organic way. You don't have to just listen to us do all of the talking before you ask your questions. Thanks.
All right. Testing. Hi, everyone. Good to see some of you again. Before we get started, I did want to give you a little bit of background on what Daca is, what it means. I've been in a lot of panels where people don't know what it is, so we're here to make sure that we're on the same page, and I'm very excited to be here with you all. For those of you not familiar, Daca is an Obama-era executive action. It is not a law. It was not amnesty. It did not provide any pathway to citizenship for people who were eligible. DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And literally the only thing that DACA did was give people like me deferment from being deported. So that means that while I have DACA, I can get a work permit, which means that I can work here legally. And it means that if I have any interaction with ICE, that they could not technically deport me, although they could find an excuse or a way to deport me. But it just meant that I could not be deported. I had a work permit. It was not any sort of amnesty, and it did not provide me a path to citizenship. To be eligible for this program, you had to meet a whole ton of different criteria, and you did have to pay a fee of $495 through the application process. To be eligible for the program when it first started, you did have to be 31 years of age or younger as of June 15, 2012. You had to have entered the United States before your 16th birthday, and you had to prove that you had lived in the U.S. continuously since June 15, 2007. You had to be physically present in the U.S. as of June 15, 2012, and at the time of requesting DACA, you had to be here in the U.S. to do that. It also required that the person applying had received their GED, was in high school, or was enrolled in post-high school university, college, or you were in the U.S. Army. You also had to pass a background check. During this background check, they would fingerprint you. They would run your background, state, local, federal, to make sure that you were this perfect immigrant so you can qualify for protection under DACA. So it did leave a lot of people out who did not meet all of these different qualifications. Right now, the current status of DACA, research shows that DACA increased the wages and labor force participation of DACA-eligible immigrants, and it reduced the number of unauthorized immigrants living in poverty. Studies also show that DACA increased the mental health outcomes for DACA-eligible immigrants and children. So this means that if you have DACA and you were dealing with mental health issues, it gave you some peace of mind to seek help, and it alleviated that fear, that mental anguish that you lived with on a day-to-day basis. As of today, there are no known adverse effects of DACA, including adverse effects to documented people, to citizens of the U.S. In fact, most economists agree that DACA has had a positive effect on the U.S. economy. As of 2017, approximately 800,000 people were enrolled in DACA, and that number is going to drop slowly because DACA was rescinded by the Trump administration on September 5th, 2017. But the full implementation of the rescission was delayed 6 months, so as to give Congress enough time to come up with a permanent solution to the protection of these 800,000 people. DACA was always meant to be a temporary solution to one of the biggest problems in this country. It is now in the hands of Congress to pass clean legislation so that the 800,000 people who are going to lose their protected status or their deferred action for childhood arrival, their work permit, their ability to be here legally, it's up to Congress to make sure that we have those protections without further harming and putting in peril the 10 million others who are undocumented who do not qualify for DACA.
So so Angelica provided just some quick guidance on what DACA is, what the DACA program is. I'll talk a little bit about how we actually got to DACA, right? I first just want to put it out there that it wasn't because President Obama woke up one day and said, hey, it's June 15, 2012, let's announce DACA, let's announce protection for undocumented youth. That's not how it happened. It did take a lot of pressure from the community, in particular, the undocumented community. I think what's really special about DACA and why it is a big loss and why it was a big win was that it was won by undocumented youth, undocumented young people who were the main beneficiaries of DACA. There are some critiques in that, but I want to highlight just the importance of undocumented-led organizing to gain big wins in our community. DACA DACA is not the answer, was not the answer, will not be the answer to the immigration issue that we have in the US right now. We need bigger reform than just DACA. But I think for now, it did provide relief to some undocumented young people who were eligible, and not just the undocumented person, but the family, right? In my case, it's not just me. I don't live by myself. I'm not just one person. I belong to a family, a mixed status family, where I have family members who are undocumented and family members who are US citizens. What was beautiful about DACA, I think, or the actions that led to DACA, was just the power of undocumented youth. Of undocumented people. A community, a group of people that legally has no voting rights, legally shouldn't be here in the United States, but yet with their stories, with their organizing, with their advocacy, they were able to change the narrative in the US around the immigration fight. Historically, immigration advocates have been US citizens, have been individuals who are formerly undocumented, have been white US citizen men who have no connection to the immigration issue, but they care about the issue, but not necessarily undocumented people or individuals who are directly impacted by the issue. Undocumented youth, I think when we first started seeing more of the movement was around 2009, 2010. With undocumented youth coming out of the shadows. In 2010, March 10, 2010, a key date, I think in this movement, was the first national coming out of the shadows event that happened here in Chicago at Federal Plaza, where 8 undocumented youth came out of the shadows, sharing their name, sharing their stories, and at that time, demanding immigrant justice through legislation from Senator Durbin. This is historic because at that time, you should not have been going out and saying you're undocumented. This panel would not have happened, right? Growing up for myself, I was told, don't tell anyone where you were born, don't tell anyone where you live, don't tell anyone where your parents work, just don't say anything about being undocumented. That's not something you talk about. But on March 10th, we had 8 young people who were like, I am undocumented. And I am unafraid, and this is my story. Using their story as a political tool to change the narrative around immigration, putting a face to the issue. You can listen to the economists, you can listen to other statistics, but at the end of the day, how many of you are gonna remember how many billions of dollars we've contributed to the economy? You're probably not gonna remember that, but you are gonna remember that Cindy was standing or sitting here and telling you about how she crossed the border at the age of 3 and grew up in back of the yards and was organizing and advocating, and you're gonna learn, and remember the stories of Angelica, Luis, Antonio, right? You are gonna remember those stories. And so we realize our stories have power, and we need to change that narrative. 2010 was a year where national immigrant advocates were pushing for comprehensive immigration reform. I don't know what that means. No one really knows what that means, but we love the word comprehensive immigration reform. We love CIR, but what that really means, we don't know yet. It could be everything from legalization for the 12 million undocumented people here in the United States, and border enforcement, more, building the wall, more border patrol, more ICE agents, immigration and custom enforcement agents deporting more people. It could be that. It could be a mix of everything. It could be ending the backlogs in immigration. It could be anything. But we were pushing for CIR. We have been pushing for CIR, our advocates have, and in 2010, that's where the strategy was heading. However, undocumented youth that were organizing through a national network, and here in Chicago through the Immigrant Youth Justice League, IJL, where I first started being active and getting involved, we realized, well, we have no bill for CIR, but we have the DREAM Act, which was introduced back in 2001. The language is there. Durbin lives here. Durbin is our senator, and he loves dreamers. And we can talk a bit about the word dreamer, but he loves undocumented youth, so there is a chance to push for the DREAM Act. It took months of organizing, of agitating, of pushing national advocates to say, yes, we should pivot and change our strategy from CIR to DREAM Act. It took months. It took everything from holding sit-ins in DC, asking Senator Reid, you're the main one here. You have to introduce the DREAM Act, right? And he wasn't happy. sit-ins in Gutierrez's office, right, sit-ins in the Senate building, asking them, please bring the DREAM Act up for a vote. And we, as undocumented young people, were called selfish. We're told, hey, this is not the time, it's all or nothing type thing. But we had to have those conversations and explain to them that this wasn't just about us, this was about our families, that we needed a win. This was around SB 1070 time in Arizona, where it was okay to ask people for papers, and then lead them to deportation, detention, and eventually deportation, right? So it was not an easy time here in the US. Eventually, we did get the support of national organizations, national advocates, and we were able to pass the DREAM Act in the House in December 2010. 9 years after it was first introduced, first time ever that it ever passed in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, we were 5 votes short in the Senate. So it didn't happen. It's not a law. It has been coming up, and we can talk more about that as next steps after DACA, but it's not a law. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of, what do we do? What's going on? What's next, right? And that's when we realized, you know what? The President Obama, who has been deporting most, the most people here in the U.S., he actually has the power to give us deferred action, to protect us from deportation. And this is when we first started having those conversations of, well, okay, he can do that without passing a law, he can do that without the DREAM Act, so let's talk about that. It took, in 2012, an election year, for Obama's administration to come out and again talk about immigration reform, talk about how he loves immigrants, but also realizing that the administration, that Obama himself was not doing very well with the immigrant community, with the Latinx community, because of the high record number of deportations. It took sit-ins in his campaign offices. It took different types of campaigns, from social media, blasting everything out, to organizing locally, to finally get him to see that we are a problem that you can't ignore. Right? That immigration is a problem, is an issue in this country that you can't ignore. June 15th came and he made the announcement. But again, it took years of organizing, and I'm only talking about 2010. I'm not talking about everything else that had happened before that, with the marches, with other local actions, with responses to other anti-immigrant legislation, to other marches in DC, right? This is 2010, with the focus particularly on undocumented young people's involvement in the strategy. So we got DACA, we're here now, we don't have DACA now, so where do we go from here? Right, and as we're thinking about what is the next step, how do we protect our communities, and not just documented individuals, not just those who have DACA, but the rest of our immigrant community, what steps do we take? And I think it's very, very important that as we're, our allies, our advocates who are in the audience, as you're thinking about what is my role, what can I do, it's important that at the end of the day, you keep us, you keep those who are directly impacted in your strategy, and that they are the ones leading your work, that they are the ones leading your strategy, because at the end of the day, you can run as many nonprofits as you want, but you are not undocumented when you go home. I am undocumented, and I have to deal with the fear that my parents are gonna get deported tomorrow because they're driving down, down the street, because an ICE agent ends up being, working with the police officer in the community, and deportations happen. There are some challenges, I think, as we're working with the undocumented community. It has primarily been a youth-led movement, particularly us who are, educated, who have access to these spaces, who are, who have the time to organize and talk about strategy and politics, right? And so as we're thinking about how, even for us as Protection for All, how do we grow beyond just it being an undocumented youth space? And even I wouldn't call myself youth anymore because it's been a few years, but thinking as someone who who comes from the undocumented youth movement, how do I engage other people? How do I engage my parents? How do I engage the señora that lives down the street who privately talks to me about immigration, but can probably, but I can see that there is an opportunity to organize and grow the movement and bring in different viewpoints, thinking about how to build power in our communities beyond legislation, beyond legalization, I think it's important to understand, right, and to see that even if we win citizenship, even if I become a citizen tomorrow, by whatever way, that's not going to solve the issues that our community is facing. We see U.S. citizens who are attacked every single day here in the U.S. So citizen is not the answer to the oppression that the immigrant community is facing, right? And how do we organize towards liberation? What does liberation mean? What does that look like? Right, and so these are questions that we need to ask ourselves as we're continuing the work, especially right now as politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike are, thinking about how do we solve this issue that they've created themselves, right, of the end of DACA. How do we protect 800,000 people, but it's really 800,000 individuals plus their families, plus their networks, right? And it's not just us. It's also the rest of the immigrant community. So how do we do that? So I leave you with those questions. And I also, again, just stressing the importance of this movement, of this work to be led by those who are directly impacted. And whatever work that you do, I think that's one of the key takeaways, right, when doing this work. And again, just stressing the fact that DACA wasn't won by Obama. It wasn't, an idea that came out of nowhere. It took pressure from the community, and as we're looking forward, what pressure do we need to create in order to get a solution to the problems that we see and that will continue for at least the next 3 to 4 years.
How am I supposed to follow that?
Whichever, yeah.
Follow this.
Hard act to follow.
All right, so to continue off the statement that Cindy made about building power and building power beyond legislation within our communities, one of the things that I'm a big fan of, if you will, is the idea of entrepreneurship. So what I'm talking about here is this entrepreneurship initiative that I'm already pitching to a couple companies. So essentially, it's an incubator for immigrant entrepreneurs with a curriculum with a curriculum ranging from like selecting business entity type to even going as far as to competing for contracts. And the thing that I value about it so much is that it's a solution that's been viable before, during, and after DACA. It's a legal and prudent manner in which one can continue providing for themselves. So, and the great part about this is that, like I said before, it's still viable before and after DACA, and there are other benefits to it, such as creating legal separation, tax benefits. This is the type of advice I would give to basically anybody, even including citizens. Anyway, beyond this, I focus on entrepreneurship because it does build power within our communities. It recalls the idea of having money circulate within our communities for longer, before it enters the mainstream. And it's something that we must continue doing because while there is much tension and action happening around immigration politics, we need to continue living with our daily lives. This is our chance to be the support that we need.
So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the response. So no, Antonio was talking about one of the possible responses that we could have to all of this mess, but I'm going to talk about the response that we have seen from those who have been involved in immigrant rights, and in the way that they shape sort of what's next, right? So as you all know, September 5th was the day that the administration rescinded DACA as it existed, right? And so this presented a challenge to everyone that was involved in this fight, including us, about what is the way forward, right? Like, DACA doesn't exist anymore, right? I know, I've seen a couple Facebook posts, Save DACA or something like that. I'm sure if you guys might have seen that online, but DACA doesn't exist anymore, right? the discourse around this issue must evolve, right? The way we thought about immigration and about ourselves changed from 2001 to 2006 to 2010 to 2012, and now we're in a different space, right? And so it's a time for us to shed the old words that we used to use, the old strategies, the old ways of organizing, right? Because we have to recognize that we're in a new space and we have to think about things differently and evolve with the discourse, right? We cannot get stuck with wording and ideas from 2012 because we're not going to win like that, right? So what I'm mainly going to focus on is the response from the mainstream immigrant advocates. And I say this because I think that from the outside, as many of you might come from there, from the outside it looks like everybody wants the best thing for everyone and that everyone's voices are being heard within the undocumented community, and that politicians are kind to us and that they want the best for us. But that's not exactly true, right? I think, especially in this state, we hold up people like Durbin and Gutierrez as these heroes to undocumented people and immigrants, but in fact, they're just people, right? And they've done good things for immigrants, right? But they've also done bad things for immigrants. So you can't sort of cash in the good that you did in 2010 and say that you're still good in 2017. And so out of that youth organizing that Cindy was talking about, out of that, those organizing circles grew into sometimes nonprofits, right? That, that advocated in DC and in different states for immigrant rights, right? One of the most prominent, and you might have heard about them, United We Dream, right? They started as young people trying to do good things, but they turned into what they are today, which is a nonprofit that does good and bad things for immigrants. And so the response that we've had, after DACA was from most people within this movement was Save DACA, which did not really acknowledge that was temporary. It was never meant to be forever. And then we moved that from there to, it was a Wednesday. I don't remember the date, but that the media announced that Pelosi and Schumer had met with Trump to discuss some kind of deal. And so that was at night, and they sort of had they sent out an official letter saying that they had talked to him and they were in negotiations about what to do with us. And so in the morning, like at 5 or 6, he sort of said, I never made a deal, blah, 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 blah. Like, that was, like, we just talked kind of thing. Like, it's not a done deal. And so out of that sort of grew this impetus to push for the DREAM Act again, right, which we've talked about. And it's sort of the same thing. And right now, there's Durbin's DREAM Act, but there's also 7 other DREAM Acts by other people, right? And they all have their own, their pros and cons. Some of them are really heavy on enforcement. Some of them are like the original one, which is pretty benevolent in my opinion. You get to be a citizen in like 15 years or something like that. And there's no real enforcement repercussions as a whole, or just yet. And so in doing that deal, right, young people understood that they were not being included, right? Because this was a closed door kind of thing where politicians were advocating on our behalf or speaking for us. And a couple weeks after that, Pelosi spoke in her district in San Francisco, and she was interrupted, and young undocumented people took the stage, and they sort of demanded a clean DREAM Act, right? Which is not what we talk about. It's now been absorbed into the mainstream, where nonprofits that were willing to negotiate with our lives and with our communities' lives are now asking for a clean DREAM Act, right? Hashtag clean DREAM Act. And so that's where we are today, right? And actually today they made another announcement, Durbin, saying that he was willing to have enforcement on the table for the DREAM Act, right? So you can see as like a pattern sort of from what Cindy was talking about to today, that all our demands always start with the people, like with young undocumented people, like with our families, as community, as organizing people, as like organizers, and then they're absorbed into the mainstream, right? By people who might have called us selfish in 2010, which they did, and they also called us selfish in 2012, and they also did that like in 2016. It's a sort of a pattern of like, don't rock the boat, but then they co-opt our messaging, right? Which I suppose has good and bad outcomes, right? Now we do have this discourse around a clean DREAM Act, where before that Pelosi incident happened, that wasn't the case. When I say the Clean DREAM Act, and when the young people are talking about the Clean DREAM Act in San Francisco, so clean as it pertains to enforcement, right? Immigration enforcement, right? So as you might be able to discern for yourselves, the administration wants more enforcement, more deportations, right? They don't want immigrants, just in general. And so so this is sort of a bargaining chip for them. So if the administration gives us the DREAM Act, we want something for it. The administration wants something for it, right? Which could be the wall, right? Which is talked about a lot. And internal enforcement, that means more ICE agents in the interior of the United States. It could also mean drones at the border. It could also be like fast-track deportations for people, and it could also be the deportation of Central American child refugees, which, has been happening since the Obama era, and all of this has been happening since the Obama era, but now it'll be enshrined into law, and sort of be made, like, from now on forward, this is the character of immigration, right? If such things come to pass. But that's what the people refer to as the Clean DREAM Act. So a Clean DREAM Act would mean that none of that is in the DREAM Act, and none of that would be included in the deal in order to make the DREAM Act happen.
Yeah, and the White House has released, I think, 7 talking points of things that they want to see in terms of enforcement around immigration. And the 7 talking points are exactly what Luis just mentioned, of more enforcement, more ICE agents, more Border Patrol agents, expanding E-Verify, limiting legal immigration to the United States, lowering the quotas around refugees entering the United States. So these are talking points that the White House has put out already. So they've already thought about it, of this is what I want if we were to give the DREAM Act, or this is what I want in terms of anti-immigrant legislation, anti-refugee legislation. So there have been conversations in the White House. So it's very easy, you know, I imagine it could be very easy to say, let's pass the DREAM Act, but let's add these 7 things that we've already discussed, and we already, you know, we have the numbers and we have the, you know, the how much we want to spend or don't want to spend around certain issues in immigration. More money for the wall. This is how much money we've already thought about allocating. So they're ready. Right, they're ready to add their points to any version of the DREAM Act or any version of any type of pro-immigrant legislation.
Sure.
So how likely is it that the Clean Dream Act gets passed, that they don't get anything like added onto it? Does that seem like a very attainable act, or is it more like we're really reaching for it type of thing?
And I'm going to ask if any of the panelists that are responding to folks in the audience, if you can just like restate the question, just in case the mics don't pick them up. Thanks.
The question was how attainable is a Clean Dream Act. I myself think that it will. I think that there might be some enforcement, but I think that if we ask, like, just like in organizing, if you ask for the whole cake, you might get like a piece kind of thing. And so I think that it can get passed with very limited enforcement. I think it's not impossible. I just think that no enforcement at all might not just be possible at this point in political history.
And if I can add to that, personally, from everything that I've seen, from everything that I know about politics, is that the chances of getting a Clean Dream Act decrease the less and less that the White House, that your elected officials hear from you. So just how we stopped the Obamacare repeal 3 times, it matters that allies, that people who are impacted, you're calling your elected officials and they're hearing from you. Because if Durbin receives 200 calls in one day asking him to pass the Clean Dream Act, the chances of him pushing to pass this Clean Dream Act increase. So on the one hand, you have this Dream Act that you can add a bunch of crap to it, that at the end of when it gets to Trump's desk for signature, it looks nothing like what the Dream Act looks like now. But if we can get enough people mobilized and asking for a Clean Dream Act, the chances of having a Clean Dream Act, or at least something that doesn't hurt so many people, increase. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, but I think that also I know a little bit about politics because I'm not here. I mean, Daca was a win thanks to the pressure, but also you can see it from the other point of view that was that precisely because it was not possible to get the Dreamers as a law. That was the answer, right? And the Dreamers also is a version of something more important to try to legalize 12 million people, right? That this country hasn't been able to really get a solution for that. And of course, from what we discussed last Wednesday, that is a mixing of racism, it's a mixing of economic interest to, you know, rename. So for instance, as you say, that was an excellent review. The Durbin Dreams Act is from 2001, right? And the DACA was possible because the president, even though had enforced the deportation, was sensible to that action, right? So I don't think that in this climate, with this president that is supporting white supremacy, you can think that just for pressure, White House and the Republicans will be willing to just approve a clean act.
I can't.
I think that's really naive, or you are not really being in what is the political landscape nowadays.
So I think the comment was around how improbable it is that we'll get a Clean Dream Act. I understand where you're coming from, and I can't speak for everyone else on this panel, but I would rather stay undocumented for another 3 years than support any legislation that would further harm 10 million people. I would rather wait and hopefully America wakes up. No, I'm okay waiting for 3 years. You're talking to someone who's impacted. I will not support any legislation that further hurts people, because you cannot understand, if you have not been there, how awful it is to live every single day in fear, to be separated from your family. Me as a person, I will never support anything like that. And like I said, I can't speak for my fellow panelists, but I will not. I would rather stay undocumented for another 8 years than do anything to support any legislation that hurts my family and that hurts 10 million people. And I know that you think that we're naive to think that we could do anything in this climate. Then let's wait 3 years, because I would rather wait 3 years and be undocumented than do anything that further enforces any type of criminalization, persecution of one single undocumented person.
And I think your analysis is probably what some people are seeing too, that we have Republicans and we have Democrats. Democrats are not united. Republicans are not united. We see senators not running for re-election because of the Republican Party and because of who the president is. I don't think we have enough votes on either side to get a Clean Dream Act. And Senator Durbin, our biggest advocate himself, has said, as Luis mentioned, right, he's willing to concede on some of the demands from the Republicans. And so I think it's going to be a very long fight. But I think this goes back to what I brought up of how do we move beyond just thinking about legislation. The DREAM Act is a compromise on what we want for all 11, 12 million undocumented people here. DACA was a compromise to the DREAM Act. It didn't give us a pathway to legalization, but it gave us some protection, and it was a win for the immigrant community. It was a win for myself. I was able to work. We were able to work. We were able to, it eased some of that stress, some of that pressure, but it wasn't everything. And so I think we're in an interesting time right now because we have Trump, who started off with, I'm going to end DACA my first day in office. I'm going to end DACA my first day in office. He didn't end DACA the first day in office. Then as he got closer, after the election, he's like, well, I'm going to have some compassion. I'll figure it out. They're good kids. We will figure something out. He doesn't end DACA until September, so it's almost a year after he supposedly was going to end DACA, 9 months after. But in his mind, the reason why he rescinded DACA, was because I'm going to put the pressure on Congress to pass something that will lead to a permanent solution. And that's, I think, the scary part, is that he's so unpredictable that we don't know what's next. We don't know if, he's in a problem. Right now, we have undocumented young people who are losing DACA every day, who have lost DACA already, who after March 5th are not going to be able to renew DACA and are going to be again, fully undocumented without a work permit, without protection. And now there's conversations of maybe we can extend the deadline and maybe they can apply and renew. And so it's this weird political time that we're in, where it's like, where do we go? And even as a movement, there's some people who are willing to say, you know what, as long as some people have some form of legalization, that's fine. There's others who are like, no, like this is about all of us. And so I think for everyone here, right, let's see what happens. But let's keep fighting. I think that's the message, right? We keep advocating, we keep fighting, we keep pushing, pushing and pushing, and hopefully we'll see where we're at next month, next year, 3 years from now.
And I wanted to add to that, so from 2006, which was a big, something that, a big year for the immigration community, right? Because people were trying to essentially criminalize immigrants in a big way. From 2006 to 2017, 10 years from there, there has been a huge change in the psyche of the American people as it pertains to undocumented people, right? In 2010, people didn't even know what DACA was. Like, I mean, I'm sorry, 2012 and the years after that, nobody even, like, people weren't very concerned about that, right? And people were saying, well, we should deport them. They can go back and start again in their own countries, right? But today, the American public is not okay with that, right? They were okay with that before, but they're not okay with that today, right? So I will say that I don't think we're necessarily naive, but I think that the work that we put in and the ideas and the discourse that we put into this, and into out has been absorbed, right? And people are thinking in different ways about us and about undocumented people. So I don't necessarily think that we've lost or won just yet. I think that we are changing people's minds, and that eventually, if we keep fighting, right, and we keep moving the discourse, then it'll be inevitable. Like, it just cannot be. There'll be a day where it's unimaginable that a young undocumented person would be deported from this country that have lived here their whole lives. Yeah.
I want to just, when I say naive, I didn't want to offend anyone. I haven't been there, but I have very close relatives that have been there, and I understand perfectly what you're saying. My point is that, the situation, one of the main problems with immigrants is that they have no representation, right? They have no representative. See what is happening in Puerto Rico. All of people, and it's not attended as has been attended in Houston. Why? What's it? Right? Let's face it. There are very strong forces that has been, now they are moving, right? So that's my concern. Trump offered end DACA from the very first day. He took 9 months because of his chaos, right? But he did it. To clean his face, he said, well, let's send it to the Congress. The Congress, I have a very bad perception of what the Congress may do. I don't think that it's going to do any action in favor of immigration. None of this comes with these guys that are the main leaders in the Congress. I don't think so. I think, of course, the only possibility is to keep fighting. But you have to be, let me put it this way, realistic of where we stand as immigrant community.
Right. And you're right. And, we hear that a lot. We hear the word naive and we're idealistic, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't mean that it's going to stop me from going out there and asking for the biggest thing possible, because at the end of the day, if we ask for the whole cake, like my friend said, we'll get maybe like half of the cake. The other comment you made about the current state of Congress, how literally the government is controlled by the Republicans, that's where I challenge you all to do something about that. Because we have primaries coming up in 2018, and we can take back the Congress at least. We can take back the House, we can take back the Senate, and then we can start doing some real work and getting tough issues addressed, like immigration, like gun control, like women's rights. There are a lot of issues. Having citizenship doesn't necessarily make everything go away. We're still going to have issues, but we have to start making sure that we have representation at every level of government. And if you are challenging us on look at what Congress looks like, well, you as a citizen, as an ally, do something about it. register your friends to vote. Go out and vote. Don't just register, because we need to take back the Congress if we want to do anything for the next 6 years of, God forbid that this man gets reelected again. We have to get ready to start doing some real work by at least having control at some level of government.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of follow up on that and encourage other folks, especially because I know Antonio has to go at some point pretty soon to maybe speak a little bit more about allyship. I was sitting in this room the day after the election last year, and we had an event we scheduled in advance with Kim Wasserman from El Vejo. And I'm used to working with her on like kind of environmental racism stuff. And all of a sudden it just felt so big, right? Like, Becca was there. Like it felt so big because like all of a sudden were things coming in from all these sides, and at the same time, so many people in her community were going to have to be just worried about like their day-to-day existence, like forget about like the big strategy. And yet that's the worst thing in some ways, is to forget about the big strategy, or to like think that we can't keep dreaming big just because we also have to be focused on the small. So yeah, I just wondered if other folks on the panel could say a little bit about being a good ally, along with what you've already mentioned about making sure that the people that are affected are the ones leading, are the ones that are always having the voice first. And of course, yeah, doing these like little things that we think maybe aren't important, like calling, writing, that stuff matters, and voting. Yeah.
I want to say something to the effect of that. I think that, you know, I don't really like the word ally, or I don't really sort of believe in that either. I believe in solidarity, right? I believe in people us fighting together this fight, because I don't necessarily believe that, well, I think we all here don't think that citizenship will make our problems go away. I think there's the myth of black citizenship. There's the myth of like the citizenship of people of color, that it actually protects them in any way. But citizenship doesn't protect you if you're not white and a male. I mean, look at the people in Puerto Rico, right? They're citizens, right? Their island is in ruins. And so, to that effect, I think that to be somebody who wants to be in solidarity with people who are undocumented, you need to listen, right? Because we all have our own political analysis of what's going on and what is possible, what is not possible, what is the vision forward. But first, we need to stop and listen, right? And listen to people and their stories, right? And listen to their pain, right? And their struggles. Because I think if we try to engage people in like a very heady way, theoretical, I mean, if you try to talk to my mom about the discourse around citizenship and stuff like that, she's not interested, right? What she's interested is in, will she be able to get a good job, right? To provide for my siblings. That's what she's interested in, right? And so I think that while there is value, lots of value on political analysis, you can't just be an expert on citizenship if you've been born a citizen and the only contact you had with immigrants was like when you went to college. Like, honey, that's not how it happens. Yeah, we have to recognize that if you don't live in these shoes, like, there's learning to do, and that, of course, myself, because I aspire to be an academic. I want to have conversations and about citizenship and what it really means and where it comes from, right? And discourse around this, right? But we have to have it together. You have to have it, not white citizens, right? That's not useful to move forward. Like, we have to have undocumented people, legal immigrants, children of immigrants, people who are born here, talk about that discourse of what citizenship means together. It's about being together, and it's about listening to each other, right? And understanding that this is an issue that touches so many parts of our lives that you might not be able to realize by yourself because you are a citizen, right? And with that, I also would like to say that listening, right, and learning, but also allowing those who are not there, right? Allowing, opening the door for those who are not there, right? Because I really get really angry when people say that they want to be the voice of the voiceless. I have my own voice, right? And I have been using it, and I have been organizing, and I had victories in that organizing and losses too, but that's because I had my own voice, right? So let's bring voices together, right? Let's not try to be the voice for somebody, right? And yes, we cannot vote, but did you know that in certain towns in Maryland, undocumented people can vote? And that it's actually legal for undocumented people to vote under the Constitution in elections that are non-federal. Did you guys know that? So we can all fight for like a political voice for the undocumented people, right? It's just that we want to be the voice of the voiceless, right? And yeah, that's just not okay.
Not just being put into a detention center, which yes means being incarcerated because they lock you away like you are a criminal and you've been tried, if you've gone through the court system. Personally, my major fear is being deported and being sent back to a country that I have not lived in since I was 8 years old. And I am about to be 34. I have no idea what the culture is like. I have no idea if they're going to accept me back. It's being rooted from your home, so being taken out of from your roots and placing you somewhere else, and God knows if you're going to thrive. That's my biggest fear. Not only that, but leaving my son behind. Because I do have a son. A lot of undocumented people who qualify for DACA, they're seen as youth, as young. No, you're talking about people who are like 25, 28, 30, and they have kids, they have homes here, they have their whole life is here. And being taken away from that is like absolutely terrifying. So right now there are 800,000 people who qualified for DACA, who enrolled in DACA, and that's just the 800,000 people who gave up their information to the government, so the government knows where we live and where we work and where we study. But you have anywhere from 10 to 11 million people in the United States who do not have documents, and they're all in danger of being deported regardless of whether you had DACA or you qualified, because the simple act of existing in the United States without documents, it makes you a criminal. So if you interact with ICE, the chances of you getting deported without due process, because due process doesn't exist for undocumented people. You can get deported without ever talking to a lawyer, without ever speaking to your family before you're gone. It's that fast. So we don't have protections, as many protections under the U.S. Constitution. Literally, the only thing we tell people when we do know your rights for any undocumented person is that you have the right to remain silent and you have the right to legal counsel, but asterisk, you have to pay for it. You do not qualify for legal assistance by the government. Like, you have to pay your own legal bills, and if you cannot afford an attorney, you're SOL.
Yeah, I mean, I think one other thing to realize is that deportations have been happening for a long, long time, even before Obama, even before, you know, our lifetimes. Like, they've been happening, mass deportations of immigrants, including citizens, Mexican citizens in particular, right, who have been deported. I think the biggest challenge with DACA is, and it varies, it depends on different people, right? It's everything from losing access to jobs, which can, in some cases, leads to healthcare insurance, not having access to that, to, right, the risk of being arrested, detained, and eventually deported, or just deported. I think right now there are more and more cases of people just being asked to sign, you know, a piece of paper and then immediately being sent to the border or being sent to their home country because they don't have access to legal representation. In these Know Your Rights presentations, it's all about, you know, it's all about educating our communities on what to do in case an ICE agent appears at your door with or without a warrant. How do you protect yourself? How do you build those networks if needed in your communities? There are different neighborhoods. Protect Rogers Park, for example, right, is doing a great job of figuring out if ICE comes to my neighbor's house, how do we create diversions? How do we make, you know, how do we distract ICE agents from getting to that individual? You know, how do we organize a social network where if you can't be at your house anymore because ICE agents are going to come there, where can you go? Where can you access social services if needed, right? Incarceration, mass incarceration, I think is an issue that goes beyond just the Black community, right? It affects us. Ours is tied with detention and deportation as well, but that doesn't mean that those issues aren't related. And I think as we're thinking about what we're doing next, right, it's how do we turn this, not have this conversation only in the immigration context, but just in the larger social justice fight, right? This isn't about just us as undocumented people. This isn't just about us as immigrants from other countries. This is about us as, you know, people who are being oppressed, who are, you know, who are suffering from the effects of white supremacy in this country, right? This country was born out of white supremacy, was born out of, you know, kicking people out, killing people, right? It goes beyond just our fight right now, and if we think about the bigger picture, it's not just immigration. We're one part of the larger struggle for, you know, for justice for our communities.
Yes. I must go, but I will leave you with a few statements. One is, if you are interested in if you are interested in fighting along with us, talk to us. We'll put you to work because there's a lot to do. Would that be? Thusly? Great. So, if you're interested in being in the fight for this, if you're interested in joining the fight, talk to us. We'll put you to work because Lord knows there's a lot to do. With that being said, there are a few caveats. So there is much more than just the almost savior-like fashion of, you know, of speaking for us, because Lord knows we've managed to speak despite, you know, the idea of citizenship. Once again, it's so much more than citizenship because intersectionality is very much a thing. Engage with your local representatives. Understand that power is not only federal. Politics, much of it, all of it, arguably, starts at the local level. People have power.
Time for a few more questions.
Okay, so
So I have been doing Know Your Rights sessions in the community since November when this catastrophe occurred. If you're interested in doing a Know Your Rights session, I am more than happy to talk to you after this because I would love to come and do a Know Your Rights session, and that goes for everyone in this room. To answer your question, if you are trying to help someone who has DACA understand what protections they do have the ability to access, is connect them to people who are impacted, because there is comfort in solidarity and knowing that you're not alone. I would make sure that they join a community organization that is actively fighting the deportation machine, and I would advise them to make sure that if you are out in public and you are approached by an ICE agent, that you remain quiet. We will not be complicit in giving the ICE agent information about ourselves so they can deport us. If it's going to take you one day to figure out that my name is Angelica, and another day to figure out that I'm from Mexico, and another day to figure out where to send me back to, cool, because that gives me time to contact a lawyer, because under the law, I have the right to contact a lawyer. I have the right to contact my family so they can contact the lawyer for me, and that gives me 2 days to fight my deportation and to prove that I have been here for more than 2 years, so I am not subject to expedited removal. It gives us time. Don't give any information other than your name and your date of birth, and other than that, like everything else, it's up to them to figure out. And again, if anyone is interested in doing a Know Your Rights session, or they know a place that needs a Know Your Rights session, I am more than happy to connect you to organizations doing Know Your Rights in the community, or I will even come out there myself and do a Know Your Rights session for you.
And I wanted to follow that by saying that ICE does not play by the law. Immigration enforcement does not play by the law. They do what they want. I know we have scenarios on paper of what it's supposed to happen, but we all know that's not what happens, right? They enter homes without warrants. They wear plain clothes. They do not want to identify themselves, that they're federal agents, or give their names or their badge numbers or any identifying information about themselves, because, ICE is sort of this rampant, like there's just no oversight. ICE has no oversight in this country, right? This is like the law enforcement, this is law enforcement running amok. It really is. So,
Overseeing that, not that they don't.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant to say, there's no oversight. I mean, they have procedures, but that doesn't mean they're gonna follow them, right? And most often, there's a lot of abuses that happen.
Yeah. I also just want to add that being undocumented in the U.S. is not a criminal offense, it's a civil offense. The criminalization of immigrants comes from the policies that are being passed at different levels, the rhetoric, what we believe as individuals, right? The criminalization of immigrants keeps happening and will continue to happen, and that's one thing that we're trying to avoid. For those that were part of the panel here last week and heard Angelica and Alejandro, right? The discussion around the good and the bad immigrant, the criminal and the dreamer. Those are usually the two extremes that we see when we talk about immigration. So the criminalization of immigrants is not because we're here as undocumented, although it is becoming, it is becoming a criminal act to be here undocumented because of the executive actions that are being signed by the current president, because of the rhetoric that we have, because of the laws that we're passing, that just because you're entering the United States, right, re-entering the United States is now a criminal offense. It used to be you get deported and that's it, it's immigration, right? But now it's a criminal offense. You get detained, you get sent to federal prison, and you have a federal record here in the US, right? So it's the laws that are criminalizing us, not just the fact that we're here as undocumented.
Becca, did you have your hand up too before? Come back to you maybe? Come back to you, or, okay.
So you had mentioned earlier that
So, um, you you are a, yeah, you are allowed a translator. Like somebody does translate for you. And if you do want to see how this goes down, you know where Union Station is. Yeah. So by the next building, I think over, like a block from there, that's where the immigration court is. That's where they send you, and that's where you see a judge. So I've never been in court, like as an immigrant, but I have been there, right? And what happens is that they call you and call your case, and most people are in detention centers, so it's like you're having they're Skyping them in, right? And they have, most often they find translators. There was a case where they were trying to find a Nepalese translator, but they were not available. They do it through like some sort of translation services, and they were not available, so they had to push that case back another week. And so, I mean, there is a Spanish translator in person there in most cases, at least here. But if you come from a place where there's not a lot of people and the language is, there's not a lot of speakers, you will have a lot of trouble there. But you're not, the government does not provide legal counsel, but they do provide that.
It's 525 West Van Buren on the 5th floor. Every day.
And that is actually one of the ways that you can disrupt the deportation machine, because as Priscilla Orta, who was here last week as part of the panel, mentioned, so judges hate it when just community members show up and observe the way that they're working, the way the system is working. It makes them nervous, and it makes them act different. So in the case of like Wilmer Catalan Ramirez, he is an immigrant that's going through proceedings right now with Chicago suing them for putting him in the gang database, and also fighting his deportation. OCAD, Organized Communities Against Deportation, will always make a call out to volunteers to show up when he has court, because the presence of the community being there has kept his case going for months, since like March. They keep, like, the judge acts more benevolent if they see community members there. And I think that's one of the reasons why they haven't deported him, is because people are watching this case. So if you are looking to get involved, doing court accompaniments where you go with someone to do like an ICE check-in, or going to the court at 525 West Van Buren is another way for you to kind of disrupt this deportation machine and let the government know that you're watching them too.
Great question.
I think we have time for maybe like one more. Yeah, Phil.
So there are the city of Chicago, because of everything that was going on right around when Trump was elected, they did designate about $1 million to help undocumented people in the city of Chicago fight their cases. So there is a fund there. And then there are organizations, CALA comes into mind. And NIJC is actually one of the recipients of these funds that I mentioned from the city of Chicago to help undocumented people fight their cases. PACALA is also a not-for-profit legal service for undocumented people to access legal assistance, because undocumented people are not benefiting of free legal assistance from government.
And those of you that were here 3 weeks ago, Mark Fleming is from NIJC, so they're part of Heartland Alliance. They do really good work along with these other works. That was very quick, so we actually do have time for one more. There's another question.
So my question is, do you think that it's beneficial for white folks and citizens more broadly to think about the ways that we benefit from the system that oppresses undocumented folks, and like, how do you think that fits into the way that we can understand the system more and like stand
Can you give like an example of how you would do that?
Well, so I'm just thinking about like racial capitalism and like white folks benefit the most from that, whereas like undocumented folks, like there are more barriers to employment and like education and things like that. So like that's the way that like I sort of see it as like a white citizen, that like you benefit off of the backs of other people, like that's the way our system works.
So let's not make this like a a confessional where you tell me your sins and I forgive you as a brown undocumented person, because that doesn't change anything, in my opinion, right? I think that there's a benefit to knowing that what you have, right, and what other people don't have, like completely, right? Like you don't want to be sort of unaware of the world around you, yes, but I'm not quite sure how, like somebody who's white and a citizen, confessing to me, I can get this job and you can't, I can travel outside the country and you can't, does anybody for you or me, does anything? So there's that. I think what is what might be more beneficial is that we have a discourse of where citizenship comes from, right? And then we organizing, right, through the way our organizations are structured, we dismantle the structures from the outside, right? And to me, that means that, you're organizing, right? And we're organizing together, right? Is there an undocumented person that is in the strategy team, right? That's speaking to, the strategy from an undocumented perspective, whether it be like higher ed for all or like anything like that. That is, I think, what can change the world. I don't necessarily think that confessionals will change ever the world. I think that disrupting the structures of the world that we live in our relationships, right? I think that's more beneficial.
I think that self-reflection and self-awareness is absolutely necessary for everyone. Not just, I think, even for us, for myself, thinking about my role in the work that I'm doing. I am a student at the University of Chicago who is undocumented, who if I were to get deported, I would probably be okay. I would probably have a decent case of fighting that in court. So I recognize my privilege. However, I also understand that I am undocumented and I can still get deported at some point, right? But it took me a long time for me to get to that point where it was okay to say, yes, you are undocumented, but you have privilege. And so how are you going to use that privilege to help your community? And so I think self-reflection, self-awareness is absolutely necessary. I am a social worker, so that's what we learn at SSA, right? About self-reflection and self-awareness, because you are going to be working, not just now, but everyone is going to be working with other individuals who have more or less privilege than you do. And so how do you interact with those communities? I agree with Luis that I think, maybe it's not a good idea to go and let other, undocumented people of like, hey, I'm really sorry that you can't travel, right? But I'm gonna, I'm gonna have I'm going on this trip and I'm sorry you can't come with me. Like that's probably not the best approach to take, right? And I think it's also for us to think about what our role is in this movement. I know for a fact that for me, it's not about working with allies only. I'm not necessarily interested in organizing white allies and how do you support the immigration movement, the immigrant rights movement. That's not the role that I want for myself. My role is with my community, with my people, with the young people, and how do I develop their leadership? How do I use what I've gained, the skills that I've learned and what I know, and translate that into community action? That's where I want to be and that's where I see myself, but I think it varies based on different people. What is your role in the movement? But before you get to that point, think critically about where you're coming from. Think critically about where your biases lie, both implicit and explicit. What are some things that you're saying in your classroom, in the class, outside around, using terms that are derogatory, using the word illegal if you're using that word. I don't even use that for actions. I can't even say the word, like I just can't because of the connotations of that word. the dreamer narrative, if you're constantly talking about immigration, but you're focusing your attention to the high-achieving, undocumented valedictorian, well, how about we talk about something else? How about we expand that narrative? What is something that you can do around that? So just being very conscious of your actions around that. But self-awareness, self-reflection is, I think, critical if you're doing this work, if you want to do this work in whatever field, in whatever issue area that you want to do. I think it's critical even for us here at the table.
And as a new organizer, I think that it's also very valuable, because one of the things that I learned is that once you change public perception about a certain issue, the possibility of making some sort of like legislative pool is that much stronger, because public opinion does have an impact on the way our legislators act. So one of the ways that you can use your privilege is by making sure that your friends and your family and those close to you are aware of their own privilege and are aware of their own biases and are aware of others around them who do not have this privilege, this white privilege that we talk about. So what are your family members doing for Thanksgiving? Are you guys talking about the racial issues in this country? Are you guys talking about the education system? Are you guys talking about the immigration laws? Are you guys talking about this administration? If you're not having these conversations with your own family, with your own friends, you're doing something wrong, and you are not helping the most oppressed try to get out of this like quagmire that has been helped created by your ancestors.
And it's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. As a Mexican immigrant, there is a lot of anti-blackness in my family. And it leads me to very difficult conversation with my parents on the words that they use and the terms that they use and just colorism and all of these other discussions that we've never had. And to them, it's like, we're not serious, right? But it's like, no, like what you're saying is still hurtful, right? And even in my own community, it's like, no, like this is an issue that is not just about, them, and this is our issue, right? And so it's okay to feel uncomfortable, and you will come to enjoy being uncomfortable, because that's the only way to grow. And I think for those, if you have family members who voted for Trump, I'm sorry, but I think you should have done something before they voted for Trump. It's not okay for, I had a lot of classmates who cried in front of me. I'm so sorry, my aunt voted for Trump. I can't believe she did that, and I didn't go to, Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever. And it's like, I don't care right now. The fact that they voted for Trump does not, it happened already. Now what are you going to do about it? And that, yes, Thanksgiving is coming up, the holidays are coming up. If you're not going home, think about why not. Think about what that means, right, in the larger scheme of things. It's okay to feel uncomfortable.
Bring an undocumented person to Thanksgiving with you. That's a new thing.
So I know that there's a couple of other hands, but we're basically out of time. If they're very short questions, maybe we could take them together, quick, with one quick kind of communal response. But I really want to be respectful of our panelists' time otherwise.
2 questions, go. We'll answer them consecutively. Go ahead.
Are there organizations or groups that will collect maybe anonymous stories of migrants and what they've been through? Because I feel that, yes, I can talk to somebody about it, but I think that when it comes from that person, when it comes from maybe, let's just use an example, your parents, or you, how is it, what is it that made them come here? And I think it creates more of an emotional attachment to that story. So I believe that if there isn't, there should be. And if anonymous, I'm sure there's a lot of people that would not want to give their name, but I think it's important to hear from them.
Okay, so stories.
Annie.
I was just wondering with the all work that you guys do, how you find pleasure and
Great. Okay.
So, to answer super quickly, there are a lot of organizations doing stories. So if you literally Google DACA stories, you will find a plethora of people who are willing to talk about their story. And there are other organizations already trying to put together like undocu stories. And I mean, this is all like a process that happens so fast. So yes, it is happening. Yes, it's out there somewhere. And then in terms of self-care, I go and see my sister. So that's like my self-care right there, my niece and my sister and my family.
To answer your question, yes, there's a lot of stories, but be aware that certain stories are highlighted because they're trying to promote a certain narrative, right? So it might not be a whole representation of what it is that the undocumented community is, right? So be very cognizant of that. And I personally, I like eating, and also I like watching RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah. There's some articles actually around the Dreamer narrative. So if you want to Google Dreamer narrative, just Dreamer narrative, you'll find some articles from undocumented people, criticisms around what the Dreamer narrative is and isn't, and like how to expand beyond that one narrative. But I think it's great, if there are organizations who are doing that. But again, just be critical around everything around this issue. Just be critical because there are always multiple sides to one story, right? And I think try to avoid the sad stories. There's hope in our stories. There's resilience in our stories. There's so much in our stories, and a lot of groups tend to focus on the bad, right? Right now that DACA ended, the stories are about, well, because DACA ended, I won't be able to work, and it will affect, my family, and it's not a good thing, which is like, yes, I get it and I understand, but where's the hope? I think as someone who isn't documented and thinking of myself at 17 years old, at 20 years old, when I was about to graduate high school or college, what did I need the most? I needed hope that like, no, you're gonna be okay. It's okay, it's not okay to be undocumented, but you're gonna be okay, right? And I think if we can highlight those stories around our strength and our power, those, that I think can also change a bit of the narrative. And again, not about the voice of the voices. Like we have our voices, we have our power. So then how do we get it out there? So those are some criteria that I would, that you might want to have in terms of story sharing. And in terms of self-care, this is my self-care. And it's very unfortunate that, that there is no time to do anything else. But, there comes a time where it's like, I can go home and I can, and I do watch my Netflix and everything. I binge watch. But it's where I can let out my frustrations from school, from work, from personal life. But it's like, okay, if I want to be angry at, this person at, at school or whatever, I can go and let it out towards, the administration and do something about it.
So I think that there's so much for us to all take away from this, but I want to thank you all for letting us listen to you, and I hope that one of the big takeaways for all of us is to keep listening and then act and then listen some more, all of us. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you, Beth.